So the college football playoff rankings have been released. They were released on Tuesday night, and the top four is Tennessee, Ohio State, Georgia, and Clemson. Surprisingly, tops Michigan for that fourth and final spot. For me, the college football playoff rankings are always so much fun just because we get the mystery, the suspense. ESPN does a fantastic job on just like their production of it all. They're kind of like number four, and it's going to be, and then they flash on the screen. Everyone's like, oh my gosh, that's so crazy. But the first rankings and then the final rankings that decide everything, those are the most contentious in my mind. So I felt it was important to address them as they followed. So we're not going to talk about every single playoff team or every single top 25 team that was announced on Tuesday night, but I thought it was important just for the sake of this podcast, kind of go through it a little bit. So Tennessee, the Volunteers are number one. There have been a lot of number one teams that have historically kind of fallen off as they've been through this rankings, but this is not your grandfather's Tennessee team. This is a really strong Tennessee team with a Hendon Hooker quarterback and very dynamic offense. I can't wait to see that matchup in Georgia. San Francisco is literally going to be on fire for that matchup. It's going to be Georgia's defense versus Tennessee's offense. Which one of that? It's like a balancing act. Who's going to come out on top? Which other side of the ball is going to make an impact? Is it going to be Georgia's offense? Are they going to be able to sustain drives like they have all season? Stetson Bennett, who's been playing much better. But which Bulldog team are we going to see? Are we going to see a Bulldog team that dominates against Florida, beats the heck out of Oregon 49-3, a top 10 Oregon in the committee's eyes? Or are we going to see a team that let Kent State hang around, or a team that let Missouri take them all the way to the final end of the fourth quarter? That is a conversation that is very interesting, and I'm very excited about it. In the committee, everyone's been worried since Tennessee won against Alabama. How is the structure of this 14 playoff going to come together? Because you got a Tennessee team that could very well lose this weekend, a Georgia team that could very well lose to Alabama, and all three of them have those one losses, and they're all quality teams. Someone is going to get left out that is a very quality team. Could it be TCU, who's currently still undefeated and could potentially be an undefeated Big 12 champion, Power 5 champion? There's a lot of conversation. How does Clemson, where the national media, it's not a surprise to anybody. It's not really a shock or me kind of, and you can see, you know what I do besides this podcast, but this isn't meant to be like an annoyance. The national media doesn't respect Clemson, and that's fine. It's just kind of the market and the narrative that's been surrounded by this team for years. This isn't anything new. This isn't just unique to 2022. This has been the conversation in 2018 when they rolled through everybody within the ACC. It's not a strong conference. It's not one of the stronger conferences. You can't really hold it. It's like comparing apples to oranges. The ACC has their strong teams. The SEC has their strong teams. But there is that distinct narrative that Clemson is surrounding, and they need to make a statement this weekend against Notre Dame. They've had big wins. All three of their top 25 wins are still in that there. They got Syracuse, Wake, and NC State all within the top 25. Those are big wins. And the committee also respects wins against Florida State, who, may I add, beat a top 10 LSU. And that Clemson win was on the road. So they are respecting that. The Clemson is 5-0 in their games when they've played teams over 500, where Michigan is 2-0. So the body of work the committee took into value, which I think is important to note when talking about these two teams. And for Michigan and Clemson, it's not about, oh, Michigan's going to get hosed. This is the first ranking. If it was like the second to last, you get a little worried. But Michigan's going to get the chance to play Ohio State in a couple of weeks. Clemson, they win out, they're going to be fine. They're going to be an undefeated Power 5 champion and potentially play a top 10, top 15 UNC with star quarterback Drake May. That conversation we'll put aside for now. Michigan and Ohio State, they're going to pretty much duke it out for the playoff spot, because whoever they play in the Big Ten West is going to be an inferior opponent. It's going to be the battle between Michigan and Ohio State. In Ohio State, payback, playoff stakes on the line. Ideally, they're both undefeated going into that. I like Ohio State personally, but I think Michigan is a much improved team from last year, even without Aiden Hutchinson and a lot of those guys that declared for the draft. There's a lot of interesting narratives. Another thing I want to tap into before we get into our next segment is I like some sneaky playoff teams. TCU, I feel, is being slightly disrespected, but I can see why. They kind of struggled with an inferior West Virginia team on the road that has kind of struggled to find themselves, even with JT Daniels transferring. But they have Max Johnson and I think it's Max Duggan and Quentin Johnson, have been an unstoppable duo, especially within the Big 12 scope. Quentin Johnson's playing himself into a first round draft pick for sure. just because the length and the size that he carries and the route running that he possesses. He's very decisive with his routes, and it's made it very easy for Max Duggan to get a rapport with him and for TCU to be undefeated like they are. They have quality wins, and they got another test against Texas Tech within the Big 12. But I would assume TCU would stay undefeated to get to the playoff. And if they go undefeated, I don't see a reason for the committee to deny them because Alabama will be out of the picture by then. They either will lose to LSU this weekend or they'll lose in the SEC championship for TCU to kind of sneak in and take that spot because teams are going to start to take care of each other. That's the beauty of this like college football playoff and why I'm not necessarily a fan of it going to 12. 6 to 8 is my line to the sand. But these teams start to take care of each other. The SEC teams start to rip each other off. The Big Ten teams, notably Ohio State and Michigan, they take care of each other. But then there's also that factor of these three teams that I have on here. They got Oregon, USC, and LSU. And you're thinking LSU, well, they have a prime opportunity to take down the number 6 team in the country and put themselves on the path for the SEC championship. They already beat Ole Miss, who is right outside the top 10. And they could go in and play a high quality Tennessee team. And let's assume that Tennessee wins out and they play LSU in the SEC championship. It would almost be like LSU was taking away a loss from their record and redeeming a beatdown in Death Valley against Tennessee, where Hendon Hooker and them came in and just did whatever they wanted. Brian Kelly, I think that since then they've been very efficient with the football. Jaden Daniels has kind of found himself. So I really like this matchup with LSU and Alabama. It is home for LSU. So this could be a statement game where they kind of put themselves on track to be the first 2-loss team to make the playoff, which would be very much a story. That's something right there for you national media people to write about. But then there's the topic of Oregon and USC, who are kind of like the outsiders of the Pac-12. Not like they're outsiders in the Pac-12, but they're within the Pac-12 scope. They have largely been the outsider within the playoff. Utah had a chance. They didn't make it. Oregon had a chance. They fell to Arizona State with Justin Herbert was on the team. They've had Oregon in the national championship with Marcus Mariota, but that's about it. They had Washington in 2016 when Alabama and Bo Scarborough ran all over them. But the Pac-12 has been largely out of the national focus when it comes to the playoff. They're almost discarded at the beginning of the season as the one that could get left out. Let's say Oregon finds a way to sneak in. They need Georgia to stay perfect because that loss reminds me of 2018 Ohio State, where the only reason in my mind Bama got in that year, where they sat out of the SEC championship and were picked over Ohio State, is because of that ugly loss to Iowa. It's stuck in the CFP committee's minds. That loss to Iowa trumped anything that Bama could have done and not be a conference champion, and they ended up winning the national championship. So Oregon's going to need Georgia to stay perfect. They're going to need Georgia to win the SEC so they can sneak in and say, hey, our one loss is to the SEC championship. SEC champion, granted, it was by a lot of points, but we've changed. We've evolved as a program since then. We've dominated our opponents. Bo Nix is playing like a Heisman candidate. There's a lot of things that can be circulated. It's almost like I'm drawing this like wide circle. It's we're not talking about this or this or this. We're talking about the college football playoff. I'm going to give you my initial prediction of who will be left to wrap things up. I think the Pac-12 is not going to have a representative solely because I just think things kind of focus and take care of themselves there. If there's going to be a team that gets left out, it's probably going to be them. I got Tennessee at 1. I think they win out, and I think they win on Saturday and in a convincing fashion. I think Georgia's offense is not going to be able to keep up with Hooker in Tennessee. At 2, I've got Ohio State. They're going to get their payback in a big way against Michigan, even though I think this Michigan team is much better. At 3, I got Clemson. So you set up that Ohio State-Clemson rivalry, which should be very interesting. And then 4, I got TCU. They're going to be a team that's going to be undefeated at the end of the season, and they're going to have a lot to say. They're going to have a lot to say within that conversation. But yeah, so if you got a college football prediction, drop it down below and say, what's your initial thoughts of the first 4? As we should say, it's almost like March Madness, the first 4. But yeah, that is our college football playoff rankings. I'm going to take a short break, and then we're going to get into who my NFL MVP candidate is and Fire and Ice. We'll be right back.